Hello, and welcome to Part 2, Chapter 4 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. Time is both resource and product. So as a reminder, we had discussed three types of events. There were moments, paths, and spaces. This is related with three aspects of time. The amount of time within a moment, time as distance along paths between events, and time is the space to decide. So we're going to focus now on time as a resource. So this approach considers the quantity of time within an economic moment. These moments are referred to as periods. For example, a day, a week, a month, a quarter, and a year are the most used periods in economics and statistics. This can also be conceived as the average amount of time per period. So for example, working 8 hours a day or 2,000 hours a year has been an approximate standard for a while. So this brings us to labor economics. Again, time is a resource. So in this field, which originated by looking at the causes and reasons for the wages workers were paid, as well as determining how many hours they would work. People are understood as having a finite amount of time with which they can devote to various tasks. The two most significant are labor and leisure. If you could use your time to earn income, then it was as if leisure was a good that you bought through foregoing its associated income. Again, in economics, we talk about opportunity costs, and so the opportunity cost of leisure is foregone income. In these labor economic models, it is assumed you have a fixed number of hours as a resource, and how you use your time affects your overall utility, satisfaction, or sense of well-being. Now, in the basic labor supply model, that's how much workers want to or choose to supply their labor. In the very, very simplest models, it is assumed no cost to working, right? So there aren't commuting costs, there are uniform costs, there's no increased cost for lunch, snacks, etc. It's not very realistic, but it enables us to understand the basics of labor supply and making decisions with respect to how you use your time, and then we make it more complicated. So there's a trade-off between leisure time, that'll be capital L, and hours of work, capital H. And we again make a simplifying assumption that there is a wage rate W that you get paid for the amount of time that you work. So there would be a fixed amount of time available per period. So 24 hours a day, 168 hours a week, 8,760 hours a year. And that would be represented by T, the total amount of time, equal to the amount of leisure and the amount of hours worked. So the price for an hour of leisure is the foregone wages for that hour. And consumption is assumed to be equal to wages earned plus fixed income. So C is the amount spent on consumption. W times H is earned income. And F refers to fixed income. So what that might mean is interest on savings, any other kind of earnings where you don't have to work for it. So the utility experienced is based on how much leisure time one has, as well as how much consumer goods one can buy. So the utility function as a function of consumption and leisure. So graphically, the simplest model will look something like this. The blue curve represents an indifference curve that embodies the utility function. And the red line represents the trade-off between consumption and leisure. and the slope of that line is the wage rate. So the idea here is that a worker would maximize their utility based on the point of tangency between the indifference curve and the income constraint, which is the red line. And in this model, there's 24 hours in a day, and we're assuming no fixed income and no work expenses. If you don't work, if you don't have any money, you can't consume anything. And this gives us the L star and C star, which would be the optimal amount of leisure and consumption given the worker's particular preferences as embodied in the utility function and given their wage rate. Now, one of the things we find is that if you include a fixed income, same model, but now you have fixed income, we would expect to see a new equilibrium, a new choice made, where there would be more leisure time, so there would be less labor and greater consumption. So the importance then of fixed income, which again could be a trust fund, it could be income from property that you have that you don't have to work in order to earn. And so what we would expect is those with fixed income, and the greater the fixed income, the more this tendency, they will tend to work less and have more leisure time and simultaneously be able to consume more. So having fixed income is a very, very important aspect. Enjoy leisure without giving up consumption. If you have lots of fixed income, and again, no work expenses, at some point we would expect what's called a corner solution. And the corner solution you can see as follows. If there is a maximum of 24 hours in a day, well, that's the most amount of leisure you could have in a day. So if your fixed income is great enough, you would choose not to work at all. The issue here is the value of your leisure is so great because the level of consumption that you have is already so great. You would find no extra benefit from earning more income by working and giving up leisure time. To make this a little bit more realistic, what happens to labor supply with time and money costs? Well, in this case, going to work has extra costs, right? So these added expenses, which we will call E, such as commuting expenses, childcare expenses, etc., and potentially also time costs, which will be capital T with a little c to represent time cost, such as commuting time, time getting ready for work, so forth. So when time and money costs come into play for working, as you might expect, we would see different answers. So the new constraint would be T is equal to L plus H plus TC. So the H plus TC represents the amount of hours worked plus TC, the amount of hours associated with going to work. So the idea is that if H is greater than 0, then TC is greater than 0. But if H is equal to 0, then TC is equal to 0. And then if there are money costs involved, then you have C is equal to W times H plus F minus E. And again, E is greater than 0 if H is greater than 0, and E is equal to 0 if H is equal to 0. So now graphically, what do we see? First of all, here's the fixed income situation. So let's say we start off here. But notice what's going on. If there is an expense to work, if you don't work at all, you have this amount of fixed income. But if you do work, first of all, we have to subtract off the expense of going to work. So maybe it goes down to here. And then we have the trade-off of income by having fewer leisure hours. So instead of having a line that's above, we have the income constraint being lower than it would be. And because it's lower, the implication would be lower consumption and less leisure time. Now, what if there's a lot of expense to work? Well, in this case, there will be a lot less leisure time and potentially greater consumption, but not a lot more utility, right? So the idea is that, yes, people are working very hard. They might be able to maintain their standard of living in terms of how much they get to consume, but they have far, far less leisure time, which means that they don't get to enjoy all that consumption as much. Now, what if you have a lot of fixed income, but it's also very expensive to go to work? Well, notice we get a very peculiar looking graph. So all the way to the right, where L is equal to 24 hours, in other words, it's all leisure, you're not going to work at all. The amount of utility associated with that is on this indifference curve of the blue curve, right? So the blue curve goes through the point of the amount of consumption that you have equal to the fixed income, but no extra income above that from working, and the amount of hours. Now, if it's very expensive to work, it may actually take quite a number of hours of working before you cover the expense to work, before you even begin to have a total income available that even meets what your great fixed income is. And so in this particular situation, as we see, there is no intersection point between the indifference curve and the income constraint, taking into account fixed income and expenses for work. In this situation, the person would not work at all. It doesn't make sense to them. Why is this so important? The issue of whether someone is going to choose to work or not, yes, is impacted by how much fixed income they have. And certainly right now, 2021, one of the big debates is unemployment benefits so strong that it's leading people not to work. These models would certainly suggest that that would be a factor. But this particular model here brings up another point, and that is, what is the cost to go to work? And if you have to do childcare, if you have to do commuting, if there's potentially greater healthcare costs, right? Because we're still in a tail end of the pandemic, hopefully the tail end. It may be so costly to go to work, it's just not worth it. And so in that case, the issue is not reducing fixed income. The issue would be increasing the wage rate or subsidizing the expenses to go to work, right? So for example, providing free mass transit or providing free or subsidized childcare. Those kind of things would also lead to more labor being supplied. So what about the situation where there are time costs? In this case, there's no extra fixed income, there's no expenses to work. You will have a reduced amount of time available to work. But if you have no fixed income, you're going to end up working. So there is the possibility of not working at all when there is substantial time costs to go to work, only if there is fixed income. If there is fixed income, no surprise, we would expect people to work less, have more leisure and greater utility. And there's also the potential for a corner solution. So having some fixed income, and even if there was no expense to go to work, but there was a time cost involved, could lead to some people not working at all. Okay, so that was labor economics. Now, we're just talking about leisure and labor, but clearly there are many ways that we spend our time throughout the day. So there's sleeping, there's eating, cleaning, working, studying, traveling, sometimes fighting, playing, bonding. These are not everything, but we certainly can imagine a utility function where the different types of time consumption plays the role of different types of goods. The utility function here would now, instead of it just being L for leisure time, now includes n different activities, so T1 through Tn, and the amount of consumption. The time constraint would be the total amount of time T is equal to the sum of the time spent on these different events. And the income constraint would be I, income, equaling to the wage rate times the hours worked plus fixed income, and the income would have to be greater than or equal to consumption. So we would state this economically as maximize the utility of the time spent on the different events and consuming such that T star is equal to the sum of the different events and WH plus F is greater than or equal to C. Notice in this particular case, it allows for the possibility that if you enjoy your work, going to work may provide you some satisfaction. So there's a lot of room once we expand our notion of how we spend our time to take into account things like, well, how will people make choices based on not only how much they get paid and how much they enjoy their leisure time, but also do they enjoy their work or they find it annoying? The idea being the more you enjoy your work, the less you will require being paid in order to put in the same amount of hours because you're getting satisfaction from that. So now this leads us to the question of a time budget as compared to a financial budget. One thing we want to take into account is what is the time horizon? How far into the future are you planning for? And then, the various periods, daily, monthly, yearly, these are the ones that are most often used. This is a hypothetical individual. Maybe their daily budget is 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for work, 1.5 for commuting, 1.5 for eating and cooking, 1 for hygiene cleaning, another hour for exercise, and then 3 hours for media, reading, and other things. But now if you make it a 30-day month, notice what's going on. Well, the typical work day, right, that's that 8 hours of work in a day. Well, you're not going to be working 30 days in a month. We would expect to see maybe 21 days of work out of 30. So now you have 240 hours for sleep, 168 for work. Notice the commuting is 1.5 times 21, but eating and cooking is 1.5 times 30 because you got to eat and cook every day. As we proceed downward, we see that the amount of time for all other becomes more than 3 times 30 because the time for working and commuting, well, that's not happening on the weekends, or at least hopefully it's not happening too often on the weekends. And then same thing with the yearly. So that's why when we're considering time budgets, it is important to know what the time horizon is. It impacts the optimization. So if you're looking at it from a yearly perspective, then you'll make plans for let's say 5 days a week for work and then something different for the weekend, as compared to waking up in the morning and it's like, okay, this is what I'm doing today. That's looking at time as a quantity, but we could also look at time as a fraction. So here we're going to present the use of time as a fraction of the moment. Right? So the new time constraints between labor and leisure would become 1 is equal to little l plus little h. the H and L are between 0 and 1. So this is going to represent the fraction of time available. Now, if we're multitasking, then the sum of the fractions of labor for each task would be, okay, in terms of utility of time, the little t's, 1 through n, and the time constraint being 1 is equal to the sum of the little t's. This is a different way of looking at the time constraint, right? Because it's not just how much time you have, it's how are you dividing it up. And we will come back to this when we're considering the economics of mind in terms of share of attention. One of the reasons we would consider using fractions is to retain the aspect of scarcity even with a seemingly infinite resource. Right? So if we conceived of a moment as an infinitely small duration, then any finite duration contains an infinite number of moments. However, there would still only be a finite share of those moments available to competing tasks. Even if you imagined you have an infinity of moments, an infinity of something, if you're looking at how you're breaking that up, what fraction of that to each, now again, you still have a scarcity involved. Now, in economics, one of the important concepts referred to is returns to scale. So returns to scale refers to the change in output relative to change in inputs. If you increase all inputs by a factor A, so A is greater than 1, multiplying all the inputs by this A, we would have the following. Increasing returns to scale means that multiplying all the inputs by this factor A, okay, you will end up with more than A times the amount you would have produced with the original quantities. Decreasing returns to scale means that it would be less than A times the original quantities. And constant returns to scale means it's just equal to A times. So in constant returns to scale, it's basically saying if you multiply all the inputs by A, then you get A times the amount of output that you began with. So how does this relate to time? Well, we can discuss output produced as a function of different tasks. So the output of time, Q, as a function of the different little t's. So how can you use the concept of returns to scale to describe the gains or losses from multitasking? Because that's what these little t's are. This is the fraction of time, all right, within a moment. That is the essence of multitasking. How does this relate to specialization of labor, especially mind labor? So when we multitask, we attempt to do more than one thing at a time. This brings in another issue, attention. So what share of the moment are we actually paying attention to a task? How does the amount of attention relate to our willpower? At what point do we transform from a single decision maker into multiple actors, as if we were multiple actors? This, of course, is important when you're talking about a business, especially a corporation, where a corporation is technically a single decision maker, but in reality, the work is done by multiple actors, in other words, employees. And what does this say about specialization of consciousness, which we will get back to around chapter 9. So let's consider an example where you have two different tasks. One is deciding and acting. And what is the impact of having strong or weak priorities? Again, priorities have to deal with the preferences that you have and how much utility you perceive and generate. So in this graph, we see two curves, a blue curve and a red curve. Along the Horizontal axis is the fraction of time deciding. Okay, so now we're not dealing with the amount of time. We're talking about the fraction of time within a moment spent deciding. Whatever time you're not using for deciding, that's what you're using for acting or doing work. Now, if you don't have very strong priorities, in other words, there's not a big benefit from working smart. Okay, you just got to get work done. That is represented by the blue line, weak priorities. On the other hand, if working smart is really important, in other words, you want to do work in a particular order, classic example would be store boxes in storage. If all the boxes are essentially the same thing, then you don't need to really think about the ordering of the boxes. You just want to put the boxes away. So that's what we mean by weak priorities. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference because all the boxes have the same thing. But what if the boxes are not the same? What if a handful of boxes have some important papers, okay, maybe financial papers, and there's something you want to have access to. Some of the others maybe have books that you want to have access to, but they're not quite as important as the papers. And then maybe you have boxes of old clothing or other things that it's not that important to have access to them. Well, in this case, you want to spend a little bit more time deciding how you're going to put the boxes away, because depending on how you put them away could end up giving you a lot more work that you have to deal with in the future, right? Because if you accidentally put your important financial papers all the way in the back and all these other boxes in front of it, now you got to take all the boxes out of storage just to get those financial papers, and there'll be a loss of utility or productivity there. So in that kind of case, there are strong priorities with respect to how you do the storage. And what do we see here? In the red curve, that represents, with the strong priorities, that you would want to spend more time deciding how to put things away. The mathematics would be the utility of the fraction of time deciding, and time acting would be equal to some constant beta times the fraction of time deciding to the power delta times the fraction of time of acting. That's little t of a. So strong priorities, in other words, more benefit from taking time to decide, would be associated with a large delta. Weak priorities, in other words, less benefit from taking time to decide, small delta. Now, just a little history of economic thought. Classical economics, which refers to economists from the 18th century and typically the first half of the 19th century, believed that the amount of labor embedded in a commodity determined its value. So this was a labor theory of value. So what was the implication? Activities that increase the amount of available labor would grow the economy. So population growth was seen as essential for economic growth. So when you're thinking about how economists were understanding the world and how they would talk about things back then, it was from this labor theory of value. We don't use a labor theory of value anymore because, one, the value of labor varies based on someone's training, someone's experience, and in particular, how much in the way of tools and productive capital they have. This is one of the distinctions between early capitalist thinkers and more modern thinkers, moving away from this labor theory of value. So that was time as a resource. Now, what about time as a product? Well, our choices and behavior affect how much time we have into the future. We're going to be interested in longevity, how many more years we have to live. We're interested in morbidity, what share of those years are healthy, and productivity, how much one can do with those years. So when we're making decisions about healthcare and training and what to do about the environment, these are three important characteristics of time as a product. Right? So food, shelter, medicine, education, energy become important resources for producing life, which can be measured in terms of lifespan, health, and value added. Time isn't necessarily the same product. There can be product differentiation with respect to time. In the same way as time is a resource, you have different tasks. Time as a product can have different experiences associated with them. Spending time emoting your feelings. How about running or thinking about economics or meditating? These are different ways where time is experienced in a valuable product-like way. So what happens when the time production possibility frontier is reached? How do you plan to produce more time? Is it more like healing or like growing? Okay, so the time possibility frontier. Is it linear, like a budget constraint, or convex, like a more traditional production possibility frontier? If it is linear, this implies what you can experience is exclusive. What does that mean? If you have time working or time watching videos, it's a one-to-one trade-off. Right? In other words, if you're working, you can't watch videos. If you're watching videos, you can't work. It's just an immediate trade-off. Maybe it's not like that. If it's curved, this implies you can have different experiences simultaneously. In other words, you can multitask. Now, to the left is a more traditional production possibility frontier curve. It's bowed out. If it's bowed out, this is saying there's effective multitasking. In other words, it's as if there is more than 24 hours in a day. Because there are situations where the number of hours worked and the number of hours watching videos, if you add the two together, ends up being more than 24. That's what we mean by effective multitasking. On the other hand, if it's bowed inward, then that is not effective multitasking. That is distractive multitasking. Because what this is saying is that if you were just focused on working, you can get 24 hours of work done in a day. Okay, can't do it too often maybe, but in any particular day you can. Or you could watch 24 hours of videos in a day, okay, if you weren't working. But if you're trying to work and watch videos, it is as if trying to do both at the same time cuts into your ability to do both of them. So that's what we mean by distractive multitasking. What's important here is to understand the relationship between a linear trade-off, a bowed out set of possibilities, and a bowed in. They all represent different ways of understanding multitasking and trading off between events. The next thing we want to consider is time as a duration of an experience. To produce an experience requires the use of time with which to experience it. May be obvious, but sometimes we have to state the obvious. So as any scarce resource or product, it is possible to run out of time. Now, in statistics, this notion of running out of time is embedded in what they call survival models. Right? So these are the types of models that are used to describe and predict how long items like light bulbs and machine parts are likely to last. So these can be used to predict how long someone will live based on their behavior. right? In other words, exercise, their nutrition, lifestyles. How does that impact their tendency to survive? And these survival models are often used by actuaries, or professionals in the field of insurance, to estimate the distribution of losses, in other words, how much they have to pay out into the future. So here's a graph of a very simple kind of survival model. So this represents the fraction of light bulbs that are still operating if they're designed to have an average lifespan of 5 years and the rate of failure is constant. In other words, there's a small probability that a light bulb is going to fail, and that probability is the same no matter how old the light bulb is. So some will fail in the first few months, but some, not many, but some might still be working after 50 years. That is one of the reasons why survival models can be very interesting. So the idea here is the average lifespan is 5. So what do we see? We see that the survival fraction, that's on the vertical axis, would be 0.5 after 5 years. So that means half of the light bulbs are still operating and half have already failed. Now, this is an example of a life table, right, which is a type of survival model used by Social Security to make estimates of life expectancy, which turns out to be very important in calculating how much has to be put away to take into account what has to be paid out as people retire, take Social Security, and how long they're going to live. And tables typically distinguish between male and female because women tend to live on average a little bit longer than men. So if you were to look at the top line, what do you see? If you're talking about at birth, right? So the death probability, that's the probability of passing away in the next year. If you start off with 100,000 people being born, that number of lives, as you see, decreases with age. That's the expected number of people still alive as they get older. And then life expectancy, this is the amount of years you expect to live, given that you've already lived so much. So at birth, you had life expectancy. This is from a few years ago. For males of a little over 76, and for females, it was about 81. But notice what happens. By the age, we go to the bottom, by the age of 21, a little over 1% of males have died, and a little less than 1% of females have died. Now look at the life expectancy. So when you're 21 and a male, your life expectancy is another 56 years. Okay? So that would mean if you're 21, on average, you would make it to 77. So that's a little bit more than the life expectancy when you're born, because if you've made it to 21, we've already filtered out that small percentage of people that would have passed away. So here's the death probability at all ages. Well, we see basically until you're about 50, it's close to zero. It's not zero, but it's close to zero. In our modern world, where there's, for the most part, plenty of food and reasonable housing and decent medicine, at least where we are now, it's relatively unlikely that you're going to pass away before 50. But as you get to 60, and certainly as you get to 80 to 100, the probability of passing gets greater and greater. So for example, if you're 118, chances are you're not going to make another year. Okay, that's just based on the historical data that we've seen. Now that's from the ages 0 to 120. If we just focused on the ages 0 to 21, notice a very important distinction. In that first year, so this has to deal with infant mortality, we see a higher probability. Now, it's not as high as someone who's 118. It is higher than, once you've made it through your first year and even up until 21. So the probability of dying in your first year is significantly higher than the probability of dying in any particular year, even until you get into your 30s, 40s. So that first year, even if in the US it's still a small probability, is significantly riskier than in the other first half of your life. And if we were to draw it out as a fraction surviving, and this is the female table, what do we see? Again, up until about 30, 40, it's a very, very small decrease. But once you get into your middle age, and certainly once you get past 60 or 70, we see a much faster rate of people dying. So what does this imply about expectations in life? If you are 20, how likely will you make it to 40? Oh, pretty likely. If you're 80, how likely will you make it to 100? Not as likely. Okay, they are not the same. This is where economics can come in, especially with respect to public health. Is it less costly to produce an extra 20 years of life when you're 20 than when you're 80? This is just dealing with reality. This is why, sometimes people don't like dealing with economics, because it is a little dismal. But this is an important concept here. If you're 20, the cost to survive the next 20 years is going to be significantly less on average than if you're 80 and you're trying to make it to 100. So again, broadening up health economics. Now, this is in part about producing more time. So time is a product. What is the cost to live another day or another year? So the extra cost for an extra year is the marginal cost of life. So if you've got marginal costs, you're going to be interested in marginal benefits. And you're going to compare the two. So what is the marginal benefit of another year? Well, it depends on a person's preferences and the value of one's human capital. By the way, those who are interested, you could try this link. It's to a BBC story where they ask the question, how much would you pay to live for an extra year? Just to get a sense of the marginal benefit of an extra year of life. And we can represent this all graphically, taking into account the components of experience that we've talked about before. In other words, how productive are you? Your experience of novelty, experience of meaningfulness, and if you play the game that you have this measure that's additive, theoretically could add up the utils and hedons and cents, as in sentimentals, and you add them up, and that would give you your total marginal benefit for living another year. And so what this graph is indicating is, in terms of productivity, by the way, this is something that labor economists have lots of research on. Productivity tends to increase until we get to about 50, and then it starts to decrease first slightly and then typically much more quickly once you get past 70. Again, this is on average. For many people, by the time they get into their mid-80s, they're done. Not everybody, but almost everyone. Okay, now what about the novelty of life? Well, this relates to the joy of being a baby, okay? Or potentially, if you're 70 or 80 and you've kind of seen it all, you've done it all, there's not a lot of novelty there. So that green curve represents how when we're young, the life is still novel and new, and that's part of its excitement, but it tends to decline as we get older. On the other hand, the meaningfulness of life, okay, that blue, while yes, when we're young, it's still meaningful. What we would anticipate is as we get older, the meaningfulness of our life in its totality would tend to increase. And so, based on these shapes, what do we see? Well, we might see the marginal benefit when you're one being up here, and then it would tend to increase until you get into middle age, and then it starts decreasing. And then when you're in older years, the value of life may tend to be is on experiencing how meaningful life has been. You might not be producing more things, you might not have novel things, but you get to savor the meaningfulness of your life in total. And so that's why even as we would get older, most people would prefer to be around another year than not. Right? So production, more stuff and utils, novelty, new experiences, hedons, meaningfulness, memories, sense. And this raises another question. What is the relationship between saving a life and extending life? When we say that someone saved a person's life, well, basically what we mean is that if the person hadn't done something medically or something heroic, that person would have died. From a time as a product perspective, really what we're saying is that person's actions, either medical or heroic, extended the other person's life. So from a health economic standpoint, the characteristic is not whether or not you've saved someone's life, it's how much more have you extended their life. And this is really important if you're dealing with issues of triage, because the question comes down, which is going to be a higher priority, saving the life of someone who's 20 or saving the life of someone who's 90? Well, if you save the life of someone who's 20, you may be extending their lives by many decades. Whereas if you save the life of someone who's 90, well, maybe you've extended it a few years on average. So from that perspective, saving the life of someone 20, socially speaking, might be more important than saving the life of someone who's 90. Now, that's just looking at the amount of extra life they're going to live. There may be other important characteristics that you want to take into account. But from a practical standpoint, it's not just about saying that you've saved someone's life. It's how much of their life have you helped extend. And so we can ask the question, what's the optimal lifespan? If the blue line represents that marginal benefit from the previous graph, and this red represents the marginal cost, and again, what's the idea here? Well, in your first year, there's a higher cost than maybe until you're 40 or 50, because just getting through the first year is very difficult. There's a lot of challenges when you're that young. But as we get older and older, on average, the extra cost to survive another year increases. So this is one way of getting at the question, what is the optimal lifespan? And from the standpoint of looking at where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, that point of intersection becomes very important. From an individual standpoint, might not care about that marginal cost. You just want to keep going. But from a health economics perspective, from a public health perspective, even from a military perspective, if you're dealing with war, these are important insights and trade-offs to be taken into account. So if we increase our productivity or the enjoyment of novelty, and in particular as we increase our sense of meaningfulness, it may be optimal for an economy to have a longer average lifespan. now we're going to start the transition to the next chapter, which is products, instead of being a moment, being more like a path. When the product is an experience, how far away is it? How much time occurs when not experiencing? So the length of the path between now and when an experience occurs is another way to understand time. So in this chapter, we looked and talked about the amount of time within a moment, even if that moment is your whole life. Now we're going to start asking, well, what is the distance between events? And what does that mean? Okay, and so that's the end of chapter 4. And the next chapter will be looking at time as a distance between events.